Thank you very much, Tigran, and thank you for the invitation to join everyone for these 2 days. I have to be frank that the theme which I'm speaking to today was actually given to me, I suspect, by Tigran. So it is a brief which I have attempted to take on, and I will certainly be addressing issues of governance. Clearly, the next paper will be engaging more closely with the implications for governance of new forms of smart urbanism. But that's something that I want to touch on in my short presentation now also. I'll certainly be focusing on the social. As a sociologist, I am sort of contractually, professionally obliged to do so. And I'm going to be concerned with smart spaces, not only in terms of data-driven forms of urbanism, but in terms of knowledge, information, and social learning. And Karima made the point yesterday during her presentation about the uncertain area in which data becomes information, which is useful in various ways. I'm going to focus less on urban form, except insofar as I'm interested in engaging with urban form in the sense of how environments interact with forms of social action and social intentions. I want to begin with a quote from Ed Glaeser, actually, a piece that he published nearly 20 years ago now in the Journal of Urban Economics, which I leave you to read. And this idea that in thinking about the knowledge innovations and the knowledge capacities of cities, the information functions that cities serve, what may be at least equally interesting, and it's more interesting for people in my realm of the social sciences, are the opportunities for learning on the part of everyday urban actors, as much as the opportunities that are created through technological innovation and mediated forms of knowledge in that sense. So it's really that aspect of the smart city that is my concern more generally, and also today, the learning opportunities it involves for everyday urban actors. Colin McFarlane, the British geographer, similarly and more recently has referred to cities as machines for learning, playing on the idea of cities as machines for living. And cities are, of course, exemplary learning environments. They're very information rich. They involve a density and intensity of social interactions, and they are powerful demonstration effects at play in cities. So not only are cities good for knowledge, knowledge is good for cities, and urban populations continually show themselves to be good learners, to have an aptitude for learning, the absorption of information, the adaptation of behavior in relation to that information, and in particular, the imitative effects of learning from others. The US sociologist, a third point of reference here, Harvey Mollich, in his book from 2014, Against Security, talks about the way that knowledge, and I would say knowledge in particular in cities, tends to be a distributed good. Cities are, of course, systems of collective intelligence, and we know that knowledge is a very particular kind of good. It is, at least in principle, non-excludable. It is also, again in principle, non-rival. Any one individual's use of knowledge resources does not necessarily inhibit any other individual's use thereof. And knowledge, of course, is enhanced rather than diminished by use. Knowledge is cumulative. In this sense, the way in which we allocate and distribute knowledge is quite, in cities as elsewhere, doesn't raise the same kinds of challenges and questions as the way we allocate and distribute other kinds of resource in the city and in other contexts. So in saying that that knowledge is non-excludable, it's non-rival, it's cumulative, I'm underlining the point that knowledge is fundamentally collective in character. And I would say that this is especially true in urban contexts. And yet, in spite of these qualities of knowledge as a resource, in spite of the collective nature and the interactive nature of knowledge in cities, we have to remark the extent to which knowledge in the contemporary city is commodified, is monopolized, is exclusionary in various kinds of ways. And with that recognition, we need to see knowledge in the city as a distribution problem. And Molich's work, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this work, in Against Security, is using this argument about knowledge as a distributed good in his argument about, and indeed against, new technologies of security. Quite a lot of the burden of his argument in the book is to say that as security becomes increasingly technologized, remote, based on digital data, often being collected and absorbed in distant locations that are distant, that is, from the point where any security crisis might arise. He says the corollary of that is everyday urban actors becoming less knowledgeable about how to deal with security situations. So there's a sort of a de-skilling of the everyday social actor as there's an increasing technologization of information about security and safety in the city. And I think by extension, we can see that kind of argument also applying to other forms of data-driven urbanism, that as information becomes better, more extensive, more intensified, more rapid, it doesn't necessarily follow that everyday users of that knowledge will become unskilled in knowledge terms. So I want to think here about this paradox about the distribution of knowledge in the city. The paradox that as urban economies increasingly are organized around knowledge functions with all of the qualities that knowledge has as a resource. It's non-rival, everyone can use it, we enhance it rather than diminish it through using it, it's non-excludable in principle, and yet as our urban economies become increasingly knowledge intensive, we also know that they're becoming increasingly unequal. And some of that inequality is being produced, and this is something else that Glaser's work has shown over time, is being produced indeed around informational inequalities and knowledge inequalities, and the particular ways that urban labour markets reward certain kinds of skill and undervalue certain other forms of skill, divisions around knowledge in the urban economy. We know that it's true that some of the cleverest cities in the United States, for instance, are also the most unequal. So New York City, the Boston metropolitan area, the Bay Area have all shown increasing income disparities over time, at the same time as their economies have become increasingly focused on knowledge functions in the kinds of sectors that Saskia was talking about yesterday, in particular tech, finance, various kinds of producer services. So a number of city governments have attempted to redress some of these maldistributions of knowledge and information in the city through making their own stocks of knowledge more easily accessible to their citizens. And the New York Data Portal has been a leader in this area. The London Data Store is another one which is held in very high regard and is an award-winning urban data portal. There are more than 700 data sets that are searchable and downloadable for use by whoever wants to go on the website. I've just done a screen grab there where they're showing that they have new information on number of bicycle hires, which of course will be of interest to their transport planners. But some of the other things that were scrolling over when I was looking on the website in putting the slides together included new data on current reservoir levels in London. It's always remarkable to me as I stand there or cycle around the city in the rain that we have all these posters up on bus shelters about the drought conditions in the city. But reservoir levels you can check. Also current information just very recently, in a matter of the recent hours, updated on the number of rough sleepers in the city. So a range of different domains in which knowledge is being made accessible to whoever wants to access it, use it, and the city hopes do something generative and productive with it. And we also have the private city offering a different angle on this production and dissemination of data. Again, most of you, I'm sure, will know more about the Hudson Yards development in New York City than I do, but I just wanted to take this rather cheap opportunity to flash up this headline. The largest private real estate development in US history will also be one of the smartest. This is, I guess it's a private-private partnership in the sense that the university partners are also private, who are bringing the data-driven technologies to bear on this extensive new urban development around important collective forms of consumption, energy, water, emissions, and so on, but also in terms of tracking the behavior of individual residents and other users of the space. It's very clear what the smart technologies will do in respect of urban services, energy, and water, and so on. It's less clear what the data tracking information will produce, but something will come out of it. This is, again, a speculative use of data-driven urbanism when it comes down to individual and household patterns of behavior. Now, all of these examples, of course, are well-funded, well-regulated city actors, both public and private, with extensive knowledge capacities, both in terms of the technologies which are available to them and in terms of the human capital that's available to them to make sense of it. But I want to look, in the minutes that I have left, at some alternative instances, at these kinds of attempts to address maldistributions of information and knowledge in the city. The first of these is the Open Data Initiative in Hong Kong. Now, the Hong Kong government does have its own data portal along the lines of the others that we've seen. This is not it. This is a citizens' initiative. It's a volunteer-run group, as the strapline says, founded 4.5 years ago, and anyone can take part, anyone can indeed take a lead in this. These are citizens who often have government functions, although they're not always out about that, who have access to various kinds of information and want to make that available through versions of citizen science in the city. So in the current year, activities that Open Data Hong Kong has been involved in includes a Zika hack, looking at mosquito levels in their region, and also a guest post recently which attempted to rebut the moral and media panic in the city about levels of migrant crime, contesting a kind of fake news through the provision of different kinds of reportage on data that was openly accessible in this instance. The last two initiatives I want to point to are two local initiatives in the city. Again, those of you who know New York City doubtless will know the Red Hook Wi-Fi initiative. Red Hook in Brooklyn, a particularly disadvantaged area along various vectors of inequality. Income inequality, service inequality, infrastructure inequality, but also information inequality. So the local Wi-Fi initiative, it's a local Wi-Fi network, and you see the mapping of the network and its concentration around particular public spaces in the local area, in particular the parks. This local Wi-Fi initiative it was initially founded as a local health initiative, and it expanded into a local service, skills, and information initiative, addressing informational inequalities in their part of the city, and in particular promoting access to local services. So trying to connect local residents to information about the services that were being underutilized, people who had various entitlements to use of municipal services and were not taking up those entitlements because they didn't know about them. They also have an initiative around digital stewards, so-called, which is a skills and training initiative for young people in the area to become the stewards of the network, so to gain informational and technological skills while engaging in community building activities. And the reason why many of you may be aware of the Red Hook Wi-Fi initiative, and certainly the reason why I was aware of it, is because this was a part of the city that was particularly adversely affected by Hurricane Sandy. And during the time of the storm, when local power was out, the Red Hook initiative still had access to power, and the Wi-Fi network stayed up. And it was one of the only local networks that were available, or urban networks that were available, and people were able to access this network during this emergency response period, and also go to the centre of the initiative as a local base. And FEMA indeed came in and offered support to the local network, took it off its Verizon local network and powered it in other ways because of the recovery and support it was providing. It's notable in that connection that the Hudson Yards development will not be dependent on the Con Ed grid, that they are trying to create an infrastructure enclave and an information enclave that will not necessarily be dependent on the local power grid. Red Hook Wi-Fi did that in a far more ready-made and tactical way. And the other case I wanted to highlight was that of Synathena in Athens, which is another citizens' initiative supported by the city government in this sense, but their support was not necessarily very material at the start. And this is an interactive website that allows citizens to access and share information about urban initiatives, activities, opportunities, services throughout their city and also beyond. And it was started, of course, in a context of government incapacity in the city of Athens. So here you see that the platform project manager is highlighting the fact that there was an explosion of citizen activity in Athens during the crisis, at the same time that local government capacity was being seriously eroded in terms of human capital, certainly also in terms of funding. They've had funding support from the Bloomberg Philanthropic Initiative on Cities to keep this Synathena network going. So it's hosted and stewarded by the city, but it wasn't invented by the city, and indeed it wasn't initially funded by them. Just to note that it does have a physical public space. It has a very modest public space intervention. It's a kiosk, which is available to citizens groups who want to use it. You can book it. We could probably go online and book it now if we wanted to. And on an unusually chilly evening, by the looks of it, in Athens, the public space outside the kiosk is being used for a film screening. So these are very modest initiatives, they're very localized ones, but I wanted to pull out 5 points from these local examples of tactical urbanism that are attempting to address issues of government incapacity, issues of informational inequalities, in a way that might allow us to make connections to other kinds of initiatives, both actual and potential, in this area. So there are 5 things to note, as I see it. The first of them is the way, as I've just reiterated, that they seek to address informational inequalities in the city, to distribute knowledge in a more inclusive and indeed a more generative manner, a more constructive and active manner. Secondly, and relatedly, that this represents a purposive engagement with information in the city. In the case of Open Data Hong Kong, in the Red Hook Wi-Fi initiative, and in Synathena, you see people seeking to access and exchange information that they want and need, rather than generating information which is capturable by other agents as a byproduct of their everyday actions and interactions in the city. So there is a purposeful angle to these kinds of informational initiatives in the city, which is not perhaps true of the tracking data that's going to come out of Hudson Yards' eventual residents that somebody's going to find something to do with at some point. Thirdly, and importantly for our session theme, these agents are taking on certain tasks of urban governance. And often when we think about the governance of cities in relation to smart urbanism, we're concerned with the relationship between city governments and tech companies and management consultants. But these are instances where we have local urban actors who are taking on some of the tasks of governance in context of incapacity, but also just as an alternative to sometimes overbearing city halls or obstructive municipalities. So they're taking on the distribution of information, they're taking on the provision of services, and they're taking on forms of social support in mediated ways that are not reducible to either public or private initiatives in the city. Fourthly, that this represents a kind of socialized knowledge in the city. And I don't simply mean socialized in the sense of it being provided by the state. Of course, a lot of this does have to do with public actors distributing information as a public good in the classic sense of a socialized resource. But these are also to point to collective efforts which sit outside or against official public agencies, which involve decommodified forms of knowledge, which promote informational inclusion rather than exclusion in the city, and which are financed in various ways. Yes, through public and philanthropic money, also through forms of social enterprise, but we might note through significant investments of sweat and smart equity on the part of everyday urbanites. Fifthly and finally, that these initiatives are informational, they are digital, but they're also geared to promoting direct social interaction and engagements between citizens. The reason why you use the Sinn Athena website is that so you can access service points, support services, cultural activities and events, shared spaces in the city, not simply that so that you can interact in a virtual sense. So they're geared to direct social interactions, and they're also geared to shared spaces in the city. And all of these, you know, the Open Data Hong Kong has regular meetups, the Red Hook Wi-Fi Initiative and Sinn Athena have these shared spaces at their heart. So they are creating that link between virtual and real shared spaces in the city. These are minor themes in the discourse of smart urbanism, but I think they're important areas of focus and of agency in the city. Rather than being about the governmental will to know about people, to know what they are doing, and to govern them more effectively on that basis, this has to do with the purposeful will of individuals to know what they might need or what they might want to know as in going about their everyday and sometimes their more urgent social activities. In the same article by Ed Glaser with which I began, he notes that if the future is informational, then cities will flourish. And these kinds of initiatives, I think, bring us to ask a key question that must be asked in that connection. That is, who will flourish in these informational cities? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fran. This was very interesting. I like your, I'd say, relatively positive tone for shared space as a public good. But a public good can also turn into a public bad. And many cities I know nowadays are not only trying to create positive public spaces and shared spaces, but are very concerned about the public bads involved in shared spaces. Venice is a good example. You can't go as a decent person anymore to Venice because it's so overcrowded that both the tourists, the visitors, and the residents, they hate all the other people. So it creates a public bad. And so there is one element where a successful public good turns into a disaster. And the question is, what kind of regulatory systems can be put in place so as to make sure that the public good remains a public good and not turns into a public bad? That's one thing. Second, shared spaces means you want to share certain things. Many people live in a big city because they want to be completely anonymous and individualistic and not to share anything with any of their neighbors or the neighborhood. That has to do with change in family formation and family size and what have you. How can we interpret that type of development in the context of shared spaces where people do not want to share anything?
The first question, I think, is probably not bearing so much on what I've said today, but it's a bigger question for all of us in this room. And I mean, you mentioned Venice. We're speaking of Amsterdam yesterday. Barcelona is the other case where cities are almost victims of their own success in creating public spaces. I don't know what the correct I mean, it's not an area I work on, what you do about big tourist economies, because that's the problem. They're talking about increasing taxes on tourism, both Amsterdam and Airbnb, and Barcelona are trying to deal with the sort of urban scourge that is Airbnb in their cities. So there are attempts to regulate those kinds of effects, but I'm not going to pretend I have any expertise in that, but others in the room may have it. What I'm more accustomed to, of course, is where urban goods become urban bads, not because they're too successful and they attract too many people, but because of abandonment, because of blight, because of the privatization of public spaces through not in the sense that Setha was talking about earlier, although clearly that is a risk, but privatization in that only certain kinds of actors come to use the space. Where older people, women, minorities may not feel they're able to access public spaces because of the sort of dominant uses of those spaces. And I don't think that those are necessarily there are regulatory solutions to those problems. What you can try to do is to create non-exclusionary public spaces, but I think that's a design as much of it as it's a planning question. We may need to ask, why are the spaces that we think are successful? You know, what have they got right that we might learn in planning design terms? The other part of the question about the anonymity in the city, I absolutely agree with you. I live by myself in the city. It doesn't mean that I'm antisocial, though. It's, you know, lots and lots of people. It's the largest single tenure share in London is people living alone. I mean, it's the most significant minority share of the urban population. But in the instances that I was talking about, where you have an underserved, multiply deprived urban environments such as Red Hook, obviously it's changing quite a lot now through development and gentrification, or you have the forms of austerity urbanism that Athens has been experiencing in recent years. It's even more urgent that people who are living alone or maybe don't have family networks and other kinds of extended support networks in the city can access these kinds of services. If you're an old lady in Athens living by yourself, hopefully you might have a neighbour who can put you in touch with these kinds of initiatives. So, we can't force people to be convivial, but we absolutely need to ensure that anyone who is living relatively isolated lives in the city, whether by choice or not, has access to information, has access to services, and this is one of the means of ensuring that that might happen. No one's going to make them go to a street party, but it may be good that they know they could if they wish to.
Hi, so I really enjoyed your presentation. So my question is, how do we measure the success of these, data portals? And I'm going to give you an example. We've been talking a lot about accelerators, right, as a source of innovation, entrepreneurship. But then what we realize, not all accelerators are the same. Some are being very ineffective. They're costly to it's a public good that is costly. So there is a lot of research now trying to figure out how to measure whether accelerators are good, rank them. Can we do the same for all these, open data portals? Are they up to date? Are they validated? Are they really being used by people in the way that will be more productive?
There are at least two questions there, because I think the accelerator portals and the city government open data portals obviously have a strong interest in being able to measure and evaluate their usage. And obviously they can look at just how many users they have, how many hits they have. And city governments, to an extent, can obviously look at the projects that, what uses their data are put to, as well as how many users they have. I think in these kinds of instances, the evaluation is going to be partly quantitative, but the numbers are going to be far, far smaller. But it's also going to be qualitative. So the Red Hook Wi-Fi initiative, one of the clear measures of that is the number of young people that have been trained in digital and technological skills. I mean, that's and these are not expensive interventions like the accelerators are or the city government portals are. So what they're aiming to do is far more localized, is far more socialized, and is less output driven, perhaps, than the accelerators are the most output driven. The city data portals are more, let's put it out there and see, what's made of it. So I think the measures of, we can't apply the measures of success that you'd want to use for the more corporate or the more municipal initiatives with these kinds of initiatives. They're not financed to the same degree, they're not pursuing the same purpose, and their gains are going to be smaller, but I happen to be someone who believes in the power of small acts in the city. I sort of think if you train one 18-year-old, that's a good enough outcome for me, really.
I really like that you started with the whole idea of distribution, of knowledge. I think that makes a lot of sense, and for the social justice issue, really thinking about distribution of knowledge is, for me, that's really incredibly powerful. I guess my question comes back to Saskia's analytics, or the logarithm, are these public initiatives, and I'm thinking, I have a student, I'll go try to do an evaluation of the Red Hook. I mean, there seems like a project right now that we could do. Will the data be captured by companies and used in other ways? I'm not, again, very sophisticated, but why would these public initiatives in knowledge distribution not be co-opted as any other system of knowledge distribution that we've seen before? And what should we be looking out for, maybe? Maybe that's going too far.
Yeah, well, I mean, they certainly could be. They have the capacity to be captured in the ways that you describe. And I do think it's important. I like that quote from Molich. It's a very simple one, but it's a good corrective, I think, to a lot of the emphasis we have on the sheer volume of information that's available in cities and beyond, by directing us to, okay, but how is it distributed? This is an allocation problem. The couple that I've mentioned, the couple of initiatives, or the few initiatives I mentioned, haven't yet been captured because they have a very strong sense, in the Red Hook case, of local ownership. In the Athens sense, I'm not sure how commodifiable some of the information on that is about, well, look, we've got, this going on over here in the city, but it's being stewarded by the city government. So the question of stewardship is crucial there. There was another example that I was thinking of using and didn't, just because of our time constraints, but I think partly I also dropped that one for the very reasons that you mentioned, Setha, which is the Ihub in Nairobi, which is a tech initiative. It's a hub, again, it's a shared space, which is all about giving people access to training, to technology. They've got more bandwidth, they can interact with others. But and the World Bank has put money into it, and it's sort of modeled on the cyber cafes that were all over Nairobi and other Kenyan cities over the recent decades. But you can see that's now becoming increasingly, it's still World Bank money, it's a different kind of big money that's going into it, but with a specific kind of purpose. But it looks a lot like it's again, it's socialized tech, but it still looks a lot more like some of the more corporate tech hub initiatives that you see in other cities.
Would you say that the knowledge cities and the smart cities are mutually exclusive? One is based on human capital, the other one is based on technology, and why are smart cities so poppy and the knowledge cities are not?
I mean, smart, it's an IBM invention, right? It's their term. I don't think they trademarked it because we're all using it for free, or are we? And I do prefer to I mean, Karima was making that link yesterday about, when does data become useful information? So I do prefer to keep these, to hold them together in the same kind of space. UN Habitat recently put out a report about gender equality for smarter cities. So they're using that language, but it doesn't have anything, if anything at all, to do with digital technologies. It's about the fact that, if you want a smarter city, you need to empower women and girls and educate them, because that's going to increase the stocks of knowledge and human capital in your city. But it uses the language of smart in, to take it back to this idea, well, the real smarts in the city is human skill, aptitude, knowledge, and the collective and generative nature of that.
Having this paradox about knowledge being and learning So how, as technology evolves, then learning not being this kind of public good and it's being more exclusive. And I wonder whether the cases that you presented are more about community building and mobilization on particular kind of, not necessarily political agendas, but with some sort of political purpose. So they're more about that than about facilitating and democratizing learning. So it's less about the technology of what cities do, which is, as you said, kind of enhancing learning and things. And it's more about sort of new platforms, venues, in these, ways of engaging in a place which is naturally more fragmentational, the city.
I think that's true. They are geared. I mean, obviously, Red Hook does have this focus on inskilling in the digital economy through its Digital Stewards program. So it has that training dimension. But yes, these all have sort of social purposes for which information technologies become useful, rather than saying, well, let's get the information and then see how we might use it socially, which is what they're going to do in Hudson Yards. It's much more driven by social objectives. And I didn't put the quote up here, but whenever I deal with issues of the design of space, urban forms, I always fall back on Kevin Lynch. I am someone who likes unfashionable theorists. And his simple one-liner from 58, Good Urban Form, where he talks about space emerges from the interaction between urban form and human objectives. And I think this is a case of this. There are certain human objectives to connect, to access services, to provide and access support. And they're interacting with urban infrastructural forms, and digital forms in this case, to produce those ends. But it's the social purpose that's driving it, rather than the fetishization of information, and then let's see what we can do with it.